So I recently saw that Streets of Rage 4 got announced as a new game, and I said, wow, 2018, and we're getting Streets of Rage 4. The last Streets of Rage game was Streets of Rage 3, and that came out in 1994. So since in the last video that I did, when I talked about Street Fighter, I did mention Final Fight and my love for side-scrolling beat-em-up games. Wow, like, we get this announcement. I'm pretty freaking hyped. I mean, I'm not losing my mind here because I got Dragon Quest and Spider-Man coming up in September, and that's going to, really fill my void pause as far as video games go. Streets of Rage 4, okay. I want to talk about my memories of Streets of Rage. Now, I have a lot of different memories of different side-scrolling beat-em-up games, and I could do several different videos or maybe put them all together into one, or maybe do a podcast, which, by the way, in case you didn't know, I have a podcast now. It's called the Geekdom 101 Podcast. It's audio. It's on iTunes. It's on Google Play. It'll be on Stitcher soon. I'll leave a link down below to the newest episode where we discuss the MCU and to the podcast page. If you didn't know about that podcast, it's down below, geekdom101.libsyn.com. But anyways, I could do videos or a podcast on like my beat-em-ups, but Streets of Rage I think deserves its own video, which is what I'm going to talk about here, because I have so many fun memories of playing Streets of Rage. So that same friend that I told y'all about, my best friend as a child in elementary school, he had first gotten a Sega Genesis, and the first game that I ever played on Sega Genesis was Sonic the Hedgehog. That was most people's first game. And Sonic was immediately like, I love Sonic. I might do a whole video on Sonic because Sonic became my favorite series on the Genesis. Now, the second game that I ever played on Sega was Streets of Rage. I have so many great memories. What makes Streets of Rage different and cool is that I think the characters in Streets of Rage are really, they're so different and unique from like, Double Dragon, for example, which had like the brothers. Then you have like Final Fight, which had, Cody, Guy, and Hagar, which were all cool. But Final Fight was pretty realistic, whereas this game, you had characters that were wacky. Like you have, of course, Axel, the main character, Blaze, the cop, and then you have Adam Hunter, who's actually not playable in the second game. Then in Streets of Rage 2, you also had Max Hunter, the wrestler, and then, of course, you've got Skate. Everybody loved Skate because Skate related to the kids. He was a younger guy. He had skates on. Everybody loved Skate. I was more of an Axel player, but I remember playing Streets of Rage 2 and just thinking to myself, like, man, this is really fun. Like, I want to get a Sega Genesis. And it's interesting because I played my Sega Genesis. I got my Sega Genesis after I got my Super Nintendo. I actually got my Super Nintendo first. And I didn't even pay attention to Sega at the time. And for those who don't know, and I'm hoping most of you do know this, in the 90s, the big video game wars for the early 90s was Sega and Nintendo. That was the big war. Nintendo pretty much dominated the market for the majority of the late 80s, early 90s. And then Sega challenged them a little bit. And then Sony came along and really challenged them. And now Sony's still a competitor, whereas Sega is not, which is too bad. Sega, I think, makes really, really great arcade games. The thing about Streets of Rage is even if you didn't grow up in the Sega era like I did, you've probably played it because it pops up all the time in those compilations that Sega puts out. Like every time you get one of those compilations, whether it be one that you download or one from, PS2 or whatever, you've always got freaking, Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3 on there. I just love the idea of how Streets of Rage just felt more grimy and more gritty, and you didn't really see that in Final Fight, which felt more like, I guess, colorful, maybe because the arcade version was more colorful. Streets of Rage had like a dark, kind of broody feel to it, so it really made you feel like this is going to be kind of a dangerous place to live. I did find it interesting that in Streets of Rage 2, compared to the first one, they changed the weapons, so you can obviously pick up weapons and fight your opponents. Double Dragon did that. I played that way before I played any of these games on Nintendo, Double Dragon. That was before I played Streets of Rage. But they had a baseball bat in the first Streets of Rage, and that got replaced by a katana. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, in real life, if this were real, and again, Streets of Rage is wacky, in real life, if I had a baseball bat and I was in the streets, I'd be able to really hurt someone. Like, with a bat. You can crack their skull open, break their leg, break their kneecap. You can do all kinds of things. A katana, though, dude. Like, if you had a katana, wouldn't you be slicing up, like, the freaking bodies up? Like, what were they thinking with that? Giving you a katana to play with. Now, it's interesting because, and maybe this is just among my friends, Streets of Rage 3 was the last one, and Streets of Rage 3 never really got a lot of love. And I don't really understand why. Like, I think Streets of Rage 2 was just so iconic that Streets of Rage 3 never got the same amount of love. That's all I can think of, because I love Streets of Rage 3. I love 3. I love the introduction of the boxing kangaroo who was playable by the name of Rue, and they have the old man who has a bunch of robots. They have an old man in the game who's basically like a robot. Like, he's like a cyborg. Like, again, this is very different from Final Fight, which was more realistic. This is just wacky. This feels like one of those Hong Kong cinema films, like Hard Boiled, like A Better Tomorrow, those John Woo films. That's what this game kind of feels like. I mean, the villains are called, the Syndicate, and things like that. The crime boss, Mr. X. It just definitely feels like those old movies. But of course, Skate did come back in Streets of Rage 3. And again, I don't understand why people never gave Streets of Rage 3 any love. Like, it just never got any love. But, I mean, these games are just so awesome. I'm digressing here. Just, it really lets you blow off some steam when you play these games. I mean, you pick Axel, you walk down the streets, you start punching bad guys like, you start punching these hoodlums. Then you go and you start punching telephone booths. And somehow this dude can break them with one punch. That was wacky. Even as a kid, I thought that was wacky. I was like, man, Axel's the strongest human being ever. Then you had that one guy in the game who looked just like 1980s Randy Savage. Like, that was awesome. The game was a lot of fun, but looking back, I mean, was it really one of the best games on Genesis? Difficult to say. I don't know, because I feel like there were better games back then. Like, if I were to put a top 10 of the greatest all-time Genesis games, I'm not sure I'd put Streets of Rage on that list. Maybe top 20, but not top 10. Because there were just so many games back then, like Shinobi and the Strider, of course, on Sega. The Genesis had better games that were similar to this game, I thought. It's just that Streets of Rage kind of became like an exclusive title, and it seemed like more barbaric than anything on the Super Nintendo, so I guess that might be why. But is it really one of the best games ever made? I don't know. I don't think it's even in the top 10, like, side-scrolling beat-em-ups. I mean, I wouldn't even put it there, I don't think. But I definitely think it should be top 20. I mean, I have to look at a list, because maybe it would be top 10, but definitely not on the top of my list, because there's so many great beat-em-ups, especially the arcade versions of these games, that I don't know if it really can be considered one of the best games ever. Now, the most fun I had with the game was playing with my friends. I mean, when you have two-player mode, I mean, it's the same thing with all these beat-em-up games. In the arcade, you have sometimes 4-controller or 6-controller cabinets, like for games like Simpsons and X-Men. Obviously, with the Sega Genesis, you only had 2 unless you bought a multi-tap, which nobody had. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know any kids back then that had a multi-tap. No one. Not for Sega, not for Super Nintendo, and not for regular Nintendo. And if I call it Sega when it's Genesis, that's just what we called it back then. It was the Sega, even though the company's called Sega. I just call it that. But two-player mode allowed things to just be a lot more fun, taking turns beating up people and hurting them with pipes and things like that. But also, I can't do a Streets of Rage Memories video without discussing the music. Streets of Rage 2 especially had, and maybe that's why the game is so loved, had some of the best music on the Sega Genesis. I mean, the game just felt like powerful. Like, the music was, even though it was obviously, bits and whatnot, it wasn't like a clear, like, instrument or whatever. It's just, it felt powerful to me. Okay, so just now I actually stopped recording because I wanted to look up the Streets of Rage 3 thing. It was bugging me all video. So it turns out that what happened was, I guess the English version of the game, the American version, Streets of Rage 3, it's called Bare Knuckle in Japan. I guess they changed the game and made it harder or something. I enjoyed the American version of this game. I had no problem with it, but I guess a lot of fans hated it. But I actually am now curious, and I want to try the Japanese one, Bare Knuckle 3. I want to try that out because they're saying that the game is much more gory in the Japanese version, much more adult, because it was heavily censored when it came over here, right? Streets of Rage 3. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I thought Sega was known as being the company that would not censor shit. I mean, the Mortal Kombat 1 on Sega was the first home console version to have the blood, even though you had to put a code in. I'm just kind of surprised by that. I had to stop and listen and look it up, and it turns out that that's probably why people didn't like Streets of Rage 3. I mean, I liked it. I never understood the problem. It wasn't that hard to me, but whatever. I mean, I still will have to play a Japanese one at some point. Anyways, let me know what your memories are of Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3, and are you excited for Streets of Rage 4? It looks like it's going to be a modern game. It's not going to be a throwback like Mega Man, 9 and 10 were, and 11, of course. It looks like it's going to be a modern game, so whatever. It's good to see those characters back. Axel, Skate, maybe Adam, who knows. We'll see what they do. But, hey, thanks so much. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you soon.